Many small organic Ontario farms rely heavily on volunteers and unpaid interns for their labor force. Joining us now to consider how that squares with food movements focused on justice and sustainability, Michael Eakers. He is Professor of Human Geography at the University of Toronto, and Charles Levko. He is a postdoctoral fellow in Geography and Environmental Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. It's good to have you two gentlemen here in our studio today. Let us, just before we do the Q&A, share with our viewers some research that you have uncovered. Sheldon, if you would, let's bring this graphic up. 65% of the workers on the farms that you surveyed were interns and volunteers, 65%. That compares to a provincial average of just 4%. And at least 250 farms across Ontario are working with interns and volunteers. So let's get into this. Michael, why are farmers turning to interns and volunteers?
Well, I think one of the key dynamics at play in this is the economic context that many small and medium-scale farmers are finding themselves in. Profit margins associated with organic agriculture are extremely thin. And what our research suggested is that over half of the farms that we surveyed, their gross revenue was $50,000 or less. So really, on a day-to-day basis, on an annual basis, they are scraping by in a very literal sense.
So Charles, in essence, no financial alternative other than to go this route? Is that fair to say?
I think that's part of it. I think there's another piece that we need to think about, and that is, as you mentioned at the beginning, part of the social movement element to this. There's a lot of young people who are very interested in learning about the food system, learning about how to farm. There's a lot of farmers who have a lot of knowledge that they're interested in passing on. This knowledge is very hard to gain from a formal education program. And a lot of these farmer-to-farmer networks that have existed in the past are changing. And young people who are coming onto these farms are interested in being a part of this dynamic ecological farming movement.
Anything new about this, Michael?
Well, I think that there is something decidedly new. And Charles alluded to this, is that historically people have been trained to be farmers through working on their parents' farms. They've grown up on farms. And now what we're seeing is a new form of non-waged work being taken up by people from cities, suburbs that are traveling to these farms to learn how to farm. Now, one farmer said to us that he finds that they're replacing children with interns, essentially. That interns have come to replace the labor and the education that used to take place through kinship.
Because their own kids don't want to do it anymore? Is that the idea?
Yeah, exactly. Many kids are leaving farms and interns are coming in and taking many of those positions or playing that same role.
So what's the benefit for the interns or the volunteers of doing this?
Yeah, it's a good question. And part of it, for me, I was an intern myself. And when I finished my undergraduate degree, I had been studying food. I was really interested in this food system. And it was something I wanted to do both at one level to learn about farming. I had, at one point in my life, was thinking about starting a farm. And I think that's what we found with a lot of the farmers, the interns we talked to, who had ideals of wanting to farm, wanting to start their own farm. So they get the opportunity to gain that knowledge and that experience in a way that doesn't cost them a whole bunch of money through tuition at a university program. But at the same time, they get to be outside, they get to be part of a social community, and they get to just enjoy themselves in a way that they might not be able to have in a more formal training program.
Okay, but let me follow up with a sort of social justice angle here. Did you at any time while you were doing this, and you don't have to tell me whose farm it was, but where was the farm that you volunteered at?
So the farm, I did an internship on a number of farms and across Nova Scotia, actually.
Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
Did you at any point feel that you were being exploited?
You know, that's a great question, and it's something I struggled with a lot in terms of trying to understand my own position. Now, I again came from a relatively middle-class background. I knew what I was getting myself into. I had thought through this, and it was something that I chose to do. So I didn't feel like I was being exploited. Having said that, it is very difficult work farming. I worked long hours.
Did you get paid?
I did not get paid at
Nothing.
any of my
Nothing.
at any of my placements that I was at. Now, having said that, there are a lot of farms that we went to where there were some level of stipend given. Now, I also got, when I was on my farm, I had room and board. I had food given to me. The farmers helped me get around if I wanted to see things.
So there's a value in that.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Michael, does this phenomenon happen at one type of farm as opposed to another type?
Yeah, we found that this particular phenomenon is very specific and quite unique to the organic sector, to ecologically oriented forms of farming. So our research has suggested that you see very, very few interns or apprentices on conventional farms. That is, farms that are more mechanized, industrialized, and that use different sorts of chemicals to produce their food. So it's unique in that sense because many of these farms see themselves as part of a social movement. They see themselves as a response to the environmental implications of conventional agriculture. They see themselves as a response to the disconnection that many consumers have with food. So these internships cross this funny line between being both labor, but also being a form of social and community building.
Charles just sort of acknowledged that he struggled with the whole issue of whether or not he was being exploited. Let me get you on that. Do you feel there is some kind of irony in these organic farms, which obviously put themselves forward as a kind of a kinder, gentler means of agriculture, but in some respects very much dependent on, I'm not going to call it slave labor, but you know what I'm trying to say here, right? Free labor.
Yeah, this is a really thorny question, and we're spending a lot of time thinking about it, and there's a few different ways to answer the question. Subjectively speaking, what's been amazing is that we've met a lot of interns through our research, and they say, am I being exploited if I don't feel exploited? And this is what we've heard again and again from interns.
And do they?
Do they feel exploited? There's certainly some that feel exploited, but far less than what I would have thought when we started this research. So that's an interesting thing. But that really comes back to this relationship between monetary compensation, which we can all agree is of value and is important, but then there's this whole bundle of non-monetary rewards and sets of values associated with this work.
Well, they get educated, they get an experience that, I'm sure it's quite distinctive.
Yeah, so one farmer said to us, universities are exploiting our youth more than we are as farmers. His line of argument was that you could go to college or university and pay $7,000 a year, not learn how to farm,
right,
because you're so disconnected from the actual practice, or you can come work on my farm, and for a little bit of isolation and a lot of great food and room and board, you will actually leave my farm ready to farm. And so that's a real conundrum. I believe very firmly that people should be paid for their work. I think that this sector needs to transition towards paid workers. But the question is, how do you maintain that along with the dynamic, community-centered focus of many of these farms?
How does a farm that's, well, let's just take a family farm that's scraping by, maybe making, after it's all said and done, $50,000 a year. How do they afford to pay even a minimum wage to these people who are currently interns or volunteers?
Yeah, and the answer to that is they can't. And sometimes offering room and board, offering food is one way that they can contribute to the to remunerating their interns. But a lot of them just, and most of the farmers we talked to, the vast majority said that they would like to be able to pay their interns, and they just can't. And that became a real challenge as well in that dynamic.
Have you come to the same conclusion that Michael has, that you believe going forward there ought to be some kind of stipend? I mean, maybe not minimum wage, but at least something, some money changing hands?
Yeah, Michael and I have had many conversations about this, and I do think that the transparency is vital in terms of a farmer and an intern having a very clear understanding, whether it's through a contract or a very clear verbal discussion around what that remuneration is going to look like, if there's going to be money involved or not. If there is not money involved, I think that the education component of those internships has to be substantial, because there are absolutely things that an intern can gain from a non-work environment, such as learning the economics of an entire farm, such as learning things like crop rotation. And we did have interns tell us that, I know that I have, especially interns who have been paid employees on farms, that when I was employed a paid employee, I was asked to do very specific tasks. Whereas as an intern, I'm able to gain a much broader understanding of the entire farm experience.
Because you're asked to do everything, I presume.
Because you're asked to do everything, but you're also open. Books are open to you in most cases. You get a much bigger picture. So that, I think that, yes, it's important to give to pay interns at some level, but if they're not being paid, I think that needs to be clear, and there needs to be a substantial education component that is, again, not just substantial, but has some real content to it.
Michael, let's just also be very clear about who is doing this, because my hunch is the public would be not at all amused if you were to find out that a migrant from, let's say, Mexico who was trying to support a family of 5 was being, that would be exploitation, as opposed to somebody who found themselves at the University of Guelph, 20 years old, and was trying to get more education. You'll acknowledge there's a difference there.
Yeah, of course. I think that we're dealing with a very segmented labor market in the sense that you have seasonal migrant workers on many conventional farms and some organic farms, and then you have a huge number of generally young, white, middle-class, well-educated women, predominantly, and some men, staffing farms. So there's a real segmentation there, to be sure. But at the same time, I think we have to recognize that the labor market, even if you're a middle-class youth, is not what it once was. Many students are coming out of undergrad, certainly my students I teach at the University of Toronto, with very, very few job prospects. So I think in part these internships are a way to defer entry into the formal labor market, but they also reflect a labor market that is increasingly casual, that increasingly asks people to work outside of a waged relation.
Well, let's also, Charles, clarify this. It wasn't that long ago that the Ministry of Labor ruled that various media outlets in this city were in violation of the law, and they prohibited those internships from continuing because they were unpaid. Are you convinced that what's happening here is actually legal?
I hesitate, as not being a lawyer, commenting too much on the legal question, but it is there are some specific criteria that make something an internship, and one of the key pieces to that is the work being done cannot be providing net value to the business. If an intern is replacing work that could be done by a paid employee, that is one of the things that invalidates an internship, and that's Ontario law. That's part of what that whole case has been about. The reality on farms is there are a wealth of exceptions to farm labor. For example, on farms, there's no minimum wage that has to be paid to farm workers.
They're exempted from that already.
They're exempted
Yes.
from it. There's also no overtime, no vacation pay, and the list goes on. So, in many ways, it's unclear to us where the legal position stands. But as long as a lot of farmers are paying workers insurance and meeting those criteria, then at this point it's hard to understand if there's any actual legal challenge there.
There was a case though, Michael. You're going to help me with the details here because I don't remember all of them. Vancouver Island, couple of apprentices sued for like back pay or something like that, saying that they felt they were at the end of the day entitled to something. I'm not sure how it all resolved itself. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, of course.
Okay,
yeah.
what happened?
Well, I'll be very brief, but so there was 2 farm apprentices that were working on a farm, and the farm host also had paid workers who were helping pick berries, I believe it was. And the farm interns felt that they were doing the same work as the paid workers.
And therefore entitled to some compensation.
And therefore entitled to compensation.
And they sued.
They sued, and they were awarded back wages because the farm host consulted a number of lawyers and said, you don't have a case. Now, what's unique about BC in comparison to Ontario is that in British Columbia, the exceptions to employment law and labor law are not nearly as deep. So British Columbia actually has minimum wage standards for agricultural workers.
Now, I gather in this case they settled at a mediated stage and therefore it didn't actually go to court.
Yeah, it didn't actually go to court.
But do you think that case has any implications for the province of Ontario?
Of course. I think it certainly sent a chill through the farming sector. When we visit farms, one of the key things that farmers ask us when we're doing interviews with them is it possible that you could see a similar case occurring in Ontario? Now, the thing that's unique about Ontario is that there's no minimum wage standards, which
On farms.
on farms, pardon me, yes, on farms. And so that makes it a very unique situation in the sense that there is no floor for wages. So is someone entitled to wages if farm workers aren't entitled to minimum wage? That's an open question, and I don't think anyone has an answer to that.
So you having looked at this now, you got a solution to any of what we've been talking about?
I think there are a number of ways to move forward. I don't know if we have a solution yet, but one of them is, as I mentioned before, I think ensuring that the education component of these internships is substantial is vital. And we've heard that from farmers, we've heard that from interns, we've heard that from nonprofit organizations. And I think the other piece of that is to ensure that there is oversight of that education, but it is done by interns and farmers themselves. And there are some very well-structured networks in Ontario that are helping to move some of these things along, to ensure that the standards are met, to ensure that farmers understand what some of their responsibilities are. And I have to say that a lot of the farms we went to, interns were extremely satisfied with their experiences. Farmers were doing everything they should be doing in terms of meeting the legal standards.
Oh, well, that counts for something.
Yeah, and it does. And having said that, we also did meet some interns who were not in that situation. There were a lot of challenges that had come up. So that's one of the solutions, I think, is the education piece. Another I think major issue is that transparency issues we've talked about, is to ensure that as long as any relationship that happens between an intern and a farmer, there needs to be transparency, whether that's a contract of some kind that's written on paper, so everyone knows what they're getting themselves into. The one other thing I'll just say about the solutions is that this challenge that we're talking about, whether it's the precarity of farm labor, whether it's the challenge of farmers being able to pay their interns, is not unique just to farms. I mean, this is something that is endemic throughout the whole food system. We see the labor challenges within the restaurant sector, within the retail sector, and a lot of these challenges we're talking about point to a broader challenge within the food sector. And I think thinking about solutions to this also means not just addressing it at the micro level of the farm, but looking broader.
I think it's an issue in the post-secondary sector too, from what I've heard. But that's another show for another day. Gentlemen, that's our time. My thanks to Michael Eakers and Charles Levko for their contribution to our program tonight.
Great, thank you. Thanks.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.